Everything you thought defined you has vanished. Your house, your title, the small rituals that told you who you were, and the dark that presses at the edges of your days feels less like an ending than like a thick, ancient night that insists on being entered. What if that night is not simply catastrophe, but the crucible itself? What if the experience of losing everything is the alchemical opening, the Nigredo, that begins a deeper kind of becoming? The alchemists called the first stage Nigredo, the blackening, an image of putrefaction, of death, of matter collapsing into its darkest, most chaotic state. For medieval writers, this could be the rotting of materials upon a furnace floor. For us, it is the sudden dismantling of identity. Jung, when he studied these alchemical texts, came to see them not as laboratory manuals for making gold, but as symbolic maps of the inward journey. He lived this map. During the period collected in the Red Book, he underwent a profound psychic descent, images, voices, and archetypal confrontations that stripped him of professional certainties and made him face the shadow as a living, often terrifying force. His experience is not a prescription but an example, an insistence that the psyche has its own economy and shape, and that loss can sometimes be the economy's way of forcing necessary change. If you are listening because something in your life has been dismantled, divorce, career collapse, the death of a parent, a public humiliation, a slow erosion of belief, this is the place to begin. The claim at the center of this conversation is simple and dangerous. Losing everything can be the necessary alchemical beginning for becoming who you are. Not guaranteed, not comfortable, not a moral lesson about deserving suffering, but sometimes true. The old forms must blacken before new life can emerge. Before we go further, if this way of talking about inner change feels useful to you, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Nigredo is not merely metaphorical darkness. It is an embodied sensory state. Imagine waking in a morning where sunlight finds no purchase on your face because your inner geography has been rearranged. The things that used to buoy you, friendships that were mostly surface, a job that defined your mornings, a faith that provided tidy answers, are gone or hollowed. The body becomes a barometer. Appetite wanes or gorges. Sleep is either a fugitive visitor or a long, hollowed sleep. There is a dullness behind the eyes and a motor that hesitates. Thoughts loop. Why me? What did I do? How will I survive? While more subtle fears preside. Who will I be if this is all taken? Who will love me if I am not who I was? Medieval alchemical diagrams always offered dark symbols to mark this stage. Crows, black earth, a corpse sunk into the soil, images both grotesque and solemn. They point to the same phenomenology. Something must die. The loss is not only external goods, but the marrow of identity. Where identity was once constructed by roles, rituals, and images, the Nigredo strips that away until the ego, stripped of decoration, meets its own finitude. It is here that many modern people feel they are becoming unmoored. The mind searches for repairs, for a quick restoration of the old order. Most human creatures are wired for repair. We seek to patch what breaks. In the face of loss, the most common urges are immediate. Find a new job that looks like the old one. Jump into a relationship that fills the void. Return to the familiar faith practices without facing the questions that collapse produced. These are not necessarily wrong moves. Some repairs sustain us through shock, yet they can become defenses. Quick fixes maintain surface stability while leaving the underlying shape unchanged. The alchemical path asks something more demanding, not merely mending the old garments, but allowing them to rot if the fabric refuses to be worn anew. This rot, though, is painful in ways that cannot be prettified. The Nigredo brings mood states we now name in clinical language, depression, anxiety, anhedonia, but the alchemical framing restores a kind of existential meaning to these experiences without romanticizing them. There is real risk here. A descent without support can devolve into paralysis. The unconscious, if encountered abruptly or without scaffolding, can overwhelm perception. Fantasies become tyrannical, voices of despair become vivid, and in some cases people edge towards psychotic disintegration. This is not a heroic test. It is a danger. Those undergoing intense psychic collapse need medical and professional support as appropriate. The symbols of alchemy are not substitutes for care. At the same time, the Nigredo has a logic. It functions as a necessary liquidation. Imagine a field in flood. The old crops, the old fences, the shallow soil are stripped away. The alchemists imagined this as a fermentation or putrefaction, materials breaking down so that the essence could be freed. In psychological terms, the breaking down loosens complexes, reveals shadow elements, and produces the raw material for later synthesis. The feeling of annihilation can be the psychic system's way of forcing attention to what has been disowned for too long. Desires, griefs, shame, forbidden longings, the parts we denied in order to be acceptable. To describe Nigredo is to describe a choreography of loss. First, there is the collapse of outer structures. Relationships fall apart, careers dissolve, certainties are exposed as contingency. Then comes a more intimate collapse, the erosion of the interior narrative that once stitched life together. The voice that said, "I am competent," or "I am lovable," falters. The self-concepts that kept you functioning become brittle in the heat of crisis. If you have lost everything, your inner map may now be a smudge. Navigation feels impossible. Recognizing that you are in Nigredo is itself an act of clarity. It does not mean embracing the pain with airy platitudes, but it allows a hermeneutic to interpret loss as not merely punitive but meaningful. This interpretive stance should be handled with humility. Meaning is not a magic salve. It does not make the bills disappear or the loneliness evaporate. But meaning can orient suffering into a narrative that supports endurance. The alchemists offered analogies, like the blackening of putrefaction, because blackness has fertility too. The soil of a forest that appears charred after a fire can be the most fertile ground thereafter. If this distinction resonates with you, write in the comments. Meaning does not erase pain, but it can orient it. One of the clearest dangers in Nigredo is the temptation to turn inward in a way that isolates rather than integrates. The shadow, the collection of disowned impulses and qualities, will emerge, often grotesque in early appearance. It can show up as inner critics, sudden cruel fantasies, shameful desires, or a cascade of memories that paint you in a new, less flattering light. People often react by attempting to subdue the shadow again, reasserting moral certainties, flaming into righteous anger, or withdrawing into numbing. All of these are understandable, but they postpone the alchemical work to bring shadow into relation with ego rather than repression. Jung taught that the unconscious communicates through images and dreams, and that taking these communications seriously, bearing witness to their content with disciplined attention, can initiate real change. This is not the same as therapeutic technique, it is an attitude of receptivity. In the Nigredo, receptivity can look like sitting with shame without dismissing it, listening to recurring dreams, noticing compulsive behaviors as messages rather than merely failures, and recording what surfaces. Yet even receptivity must be scaffolded. There is a difference between reading your dreams in solitude and doing so with someone trained to recognize when material indicates a need for clinical intervention. Modern triggers for Nigredo are familiar and banal. The unexpected layoff after years of identification with a role, the marriage that erodes under the weight of unmet needs, an encounter with mortality that strips the illusion of permanence, a public scandal that dismantles reputation, but Nigredo also arises from quieter accumulations, a long pattern of denying parts of oneself until the vow breaks, a slow burnout whose final step is a collapse. These are not moral failures, but systemic strains. The alchemical metaphor insists the self sometimes must be unmade before it can be remade. In describing Nigredo, we must insist on compassion. To experience the Black Night is not a sign of moral bankruptcy, but of being human in an age that compresses complexity. The person in Nigredo is often ashamed. They hide the collapse because social narratives valorize continuity and success. This hiding compounds the pain. One of the first practical dispositions that helps is the small, stubborn permission to say, "This is hard, I am struggling." Naming the experience reduces its tyrannical solitude. A second practical signpost is patience. Alchemical work is slow by necessity. The crucible is a slow furnace. Rapid changes in the laboratory produce destruction rather than transformation. In inner work, impatience fuels quick repairs, compulsive projects, and spiritual bypassing. Patience is not passive surrender. It is a disciplined refusal to rush the work. It is to let the unconscious speak and wait for it to integrate rather than trying to force an immediate narrative that feels tidy. The third signpost is support. Friends, mentors, communities, therapists. The alchemists worked in guilds. Transformation in lived human lives rarely occurs in hermetic isolation. Support does not always mean fixing. Often it is simply presence, testimony that you are not alone in your suffering. Practically, this can look like steady friendships, a clinician who monitors safety, a spiritual director who asks discerning questions, or a peer group that knows your history and can hold you when you cannot. Support is a bulwark against the seductive voices that urge destructive remedies. We must be candid about risk. The descent into the unconscious can reveal not only neglected virtues, but also severe pathology. If you find yourself experiencing persistent hallucinations, rapid personality instability, suicidal ideation, or an inability to maintain basic functioning, seek immediate professional help. The alchemical narrative offers meaning, but it cannot substitute for clinical interventions that may save life and restore capacity. There is no shame in needing medication, hospitalization, or intensive therapy. These are instruments that can make the later symbolic work possible. If Nigredo is the clearing away, the next stage in the alchemical map is albedo, the whitening. But before moving toward the cool dawn, it is crucial to name what the Nigredo looks and feels like in everyday living. People in Nigredo often report technical experiences, a sense of flattening effect, persistent ruminative loops, a collapse of personal narrative. They also experience imaginal phenomena, vivid dreams, recurring motifs, dark water, burial, decay, or sudden confrontations with shame. These imaginal materials are not mere byproducts, they are the psyche speaking in its native media. To translate them kindly and carefully is to create the possibility of albedo. Consider a case that is, in outline, ordinary. A mid-career architect loses his firm after a partner embezzles funds. Professionally, he is ruined. Reputationally, he is tarnished. At first, he attempts immediate restoration, starts a consulting gig, rebrands his portfolio, forces himself into presentations. But the real work begins when forced solitude allows memory to surface. Childhood shame about being the child of immigrant laborers whom he once tried to outrun. The aesthetic compromises he made to secure prestige, the habit of speaking louder to cover insecurity. In nightly dreams, he is back in a cramped attic, stamping out small fires he pretends not to see. The Nigredo here manifests as both external ruin and inner revelation. If he resists by rebranding, the cycle continues. If he allows the images to be acknowledged and examined, the material cools and clarity begins to appear. Albedo is not immediate. It begins as a cooling that follows the fever of Nigredo. The images that once were monstrous begin to reveal structure. In alchemical terms, whiteness connotes washing, purification, and the revealing of previously hidden forms. Psychologically, this is the point where reflection, meaning-making, and analysis can yield insight. One begins to see patterns, the recurring relational dynamics, the defensive scripts, the values that were never truly personal but adopted for survival. This is where disciplined inward work pays off. The practice of keeping a journal becomes vital, not as a checklist for productivity, but as an instrument for noticing. Record a dream with details. Note the images that recur during the day. Write down the moments when shame flares and trace backward what triggered it, what story it told about the self. This is not therapy, but a form of disciplined attention that creates data for transformation. It is also the stage when encountering a skilled guide, whether a therapist, analyst, or reflective peer, can make a significant difference. The guide helps distinguish between personal narrative and archetypal themes, and more importantly, helps the person avoid getting stuck in clever interpretations that never translate into lived change. There is a temptation in albedo to remain forever in insight. Endless interpretation feels like activity and can spare the existential labor of changing. Many people become virtuosos of interpretation, able to name their patterns, to map their dreams, to explain their childhoods, while continuing the same behaviors that made them suffer. The alchemical warning is clear. Understanding is not yet integration. White is not yet gold. The albedo stage cleans the material so that the next operations can build upon it. Before we go on, if this has been useful to you so far, you can support this work by liking the video. It lets me know that this kind of content is worth continuing. A crucial function here is the emergence of the transcendent function, a term Jung used to describe the psyche's capacity to create a third solution out of apparent opposites. In the middle of conflict, the pull of the old identity and the calling of the new, something novel can arise that is neither old nor merely a compromise, but a new synthesis pointing toward vocation. The transcendent function is not coerced. It is allowed. This requires a different mode of attention, less managerial control and more receptivity, a willingness to let images and dreams suggest possibilities that are not immediately legible to the ego. This is also the stage of tentative experiments, small acts, trying a new form of work, practicing art that had been dismissed as impractical, traveling to a place that evokes curiosity, are like test fires for new materials. They produce feedback, what resonates, what drains the spirit, what seems to align with a deeper sense of rightness. Importantly, these experiments are humble. They are not grand career pivots dictated by magazine narratives, but often small, patient shifts, volunteering, taking a class, cultivating a disciplined practice that orients time differently. Jung's own life offers an anchor here. After the Red Book period, he did not claim instant mastery. Instead, he spent years writing, reflecting, creating maps of archetypal dynamics that others later found transformative. His journey shows that descent can lead to new language and vocation, but only if the person is willing to live into the subtler textures of emergence rather than seeking immediate public recognition or success. The process is slow and often unglamorous, rewriting life's small routines, changing how one speaks in relationships, pursuing practices that both nourish and discipline. As albedo begins to settle, the person often notices shifts in dream life. The dark images replace themselves with cleaner, more luminous symbols. Light on water, a white cloth, a figure that invites rather than pursues. These images signal purification, but they are not the end. The next stage, citrinitas, the yellowing, represents dawn, the first hints of purpose, the small, insistent thrum of a calling that is not just the ego's ambition, but something that strikes a deeper chord. Citrinitas is where creativity and meaning begin to find nuclear structure. Yet between albedo and citrinitas, there is always the risk of stalling. People can become enamored with insight and hold themselves in a permanent workshop of analysis. They can find identity in being reflective only. The alchemical map warns against this. Purification is a means, not an end. The inner economy requires movement from seeing to doing, from feeling to embodied choice. If you are inside Nigredo or hovering into albedo, there are three practical threads to hold: trust in the psyche's purposiveness, patience for slow transformation, and support that keeps you tethered to life. Trust does not mean naive optimism. It is a tested faith that the unconscious communicates in patterns toward differentiation. This trust grows by witnessing the truth of small discoveries, a dream decoded that changes how you act, a small decision that resonates as right in your bones. Patience is the refusal to rush. Support is the social scaffolding that keeps risk from becoming ruin. A simple, concrete action you can take now is this journal prompt. Inventory the losses you have experienced, and then, separately, write what each loss freed you from, however small. Do this without forcing a tidy narrative of growth. Let the list be messy. The point is to practice bearing both loss and the small openings it allows, recognizing that rupture creates space even before you know what will fill it. There is more to say. The ways citrinitas unfolds, the perilous heart of mortificatio, and the eventual rubedo that is not perfection, but integration. Yet to move into those territories prematurely would be to skip the fierce and necessary labor that Nigredo demands. For many, the real challenge is not intellectual comprehension, but allowing the dark to speak its truth without becoming a tyrant. For now, imagine standing at a shoreline at night. The tide has washed away everything recognizable from the beach: driftwood, footprints, the umbrella you used to stake your place. All gone. You can run inland to the buffet of familiar consumption and try to brand a new identity on the sand, or you can stay shivering and watch the black water. If you watch long enough, constellations of foam and wreckage begin to arrange themselves into patterns you could not have seen from the safety of the old promenade. That watching is the beginning of alchemical attention. The question is whether you have companions at the edge, whether you have patience, and whether you will be honest about when the watching turns into a collapse that needs help. The path ahead is neither guaranteed nor gentle. There will be moments when you must surrender projects, relationships, and illusions. There will also be moments of unexpected luminosity, dreams that reveal a face in the dark, an image that feels like a direction, an insight that for a fleeting second lets you breathe. If you choose to continue, you will not do so by scolding yourself or by rehearsing triumphal narratives. You will go on by practicing attention, by keeping company with others, and by accepting the possibility that your life may be reformed around a center you have not yet met. As the night deepens, one image remains instructive. The philosopher's stone was not a stone in medieval texts, but the symbol of inner wholeness, the culmination of processes that required dissolution, reconstitution, and integration. The Black Night is the necessary first alchemical operation in this tradition. Losing everything is the crucible that makes the rest possible. The rest is not guaranteed. It requires work, luck, support, and, if one is willing to speak the word that still unsettles modern sensibilities, a kind of grace, a non-volitional moment when the psyche offers a symbol that changes the tone of action. That moment cannot be forced, only prepared for. There will be more to map: the precise texture of citrinitas, the deadly seriousness of mortificatio, where ego death becomes acute, and the slow red integration of rubedo. But before traversing those landscapes, the immediate care is practical and unglamorous. Keep a notebook, Name your losses, secure safety, find a steady witness. Resist quick fixes that merely repaint the old. Allow images to be noted rather than immediately explained. Above all, remember this paradox. The annihilation you feel may be the clearing that enables a different kind of life. One that is less about adaptation to roles and more about living from a center that has been tested in fire. You are not required to romanticize the darkness. Honor its pain and fight for your safety. And if you are willing to stay with it, you may discover that the black soil under your feet is quietly fertile. The next phase, the slow whitening that follows the blackening, begins when you can look at what has come up without immediately fleeing. It is a subtle, patient process that asks you to practice presence with what surfaces, to name the images, to try small experiments in living, and to invite companions who will hold you when the depth of loss threatens to become annihilation. At some point, if descent continues with care, a new pattern will press. Not a return to the old, but a fragile dawning of purpose, a yellowing that reorients life toward what feels true. But even approaching that dawn, there remains one final dangerous pivot, the mortificatio, where the structures you still cling to are asked to die more deeply. That moment can feel like being swallowed whole, and it is here that the line between transformative descent and catastrophic collapse is thinnest. There is no easy compass for that crossing, only practices that increase the odds of passage, steady companions, medical discernment when needed, disciplined attention, and a willingness to accept help. If you would like a simple practice to begin tonight, take 10 minutes and write 3 things. One loss you name without euphemism, one thing that this loss made possible, however faint, and one small experiment you can test in the next week that honors the possibility that something new might be trying to emerge. Keep it private and return to it after 3 days to notice whether the small experiment moved you at all. There is a long way to go from the blackness to the integrated self, and there are no maps that guarantee safe passage. Jung's encounter with alchemy taught him that the unconscious speaks in symbols, and that these symbols can become road signs if we learn to read them, not as instructions, but as invitations to move. In the next part of this journey, we will follow the faint light of citrinitas into beginnings of vocation, and we will confront the danger and the necessity of mortificatio, the core of the crucible where the ego's last certainties are burned away. For now, hold the 3 threads: trust in the psyche's purposiveness, patient endurance, and steady support. Keep your notebook. Notice your dreams. You have already begun the complicating work. Something has been taken or given up, and the ground beneath your feet feels unsteady. The alchemical tradition names this as the essential first labor. The question that now stands before you, raw and unadorned, is not whether it hurts. Of course it does, but what you will do with the hurt. Will you sprint for the old shore, or will you stay long enough to watch what the tide reveals? If the dark tide has already stripped the shoreline bare, there will sooner or later be signs that something like dawn is moving beneath the surface. The yellowing of citrinitas is not a dramatic sunrise, but a slow, stubborn change in hue. The black soil begins to warm, a faint light gathers in the gutters of dreams, and a subtle appetite for meaning replaces the sheer will to survive. Citrinitas, alchemical yellowing, names that liminal time when purpose first shows itself as a possibility rather than a slogan. It is the season when form begins to reorganize from the inside. Imagine a woman who, after a bitter layoff and the collapse of a marriage, finds herself cooking meals again, not out of duty, but because the rhythm of chopping and stirring quiets an inner chatter. That small practice becomes an axis for a larger curiosity. She begins to experiment with local food systems, volunteers at a community kitchen, and eventually trains in nutrition for underserved neighborhoods. Her life does not instantly become heroic. There are lean months, insufficient pay, and doubt, But the source of her meaning has shifted. It issues less from external recognition than from a felt alignment between work and an interior compass. That slow emergence is citrinitas, the subtle yellowing that signals a new center forming. Psychologically, citrinitas corresponds to the activation of the transcendent function, Jung's way of naming the psyche's capacity to produce a third, creative solution out of two opposing tensions. When the old identity and the call toward something new collide, they need a mediator. The mediator often arrives as image, dream, or a sudden felt sense, an idea that is neither the old self strategy nor mere escapism. The transcendent function is not a clever plan. It is a spontaneous symbol that draws the person toward an experiment in living. The experiment may be modest, a class, a project, a new relationship formed under different terms. The litmus test is not immediate success, but a bodily yes, a sense of rightness that resonates across thinking, feeling, and action. Citrinitas requires courage in a particular way. It asks that you test what seems true, and then test it again and again. The experiments are not dramatic grand gestures, but repeated small commitments. The weekly class, the practice of responding differently in a strained conversation, the refusal to re-enter a relationship on the old terms. These small acts accumulate like kindling. Over time, they produce a heat that can sustain a new shape. There is also a cultural temptation to rush citrinitas into marketable reinvention. We live in a discourse that rewards courses, quick career pivots, and the narrative of radical reinvention packaged as glamour. The alchemical map warns us to be skeptical of anything that bypasses integration. A career change, enacted purely to regain status or income, may offer short-term relief, but not the deeper reorientation that citrinitas promises. The question to keep asking is not, will this make me look successful, but does this practice change how I inhabit my days, my body, my relationships? If citrinitas is hopeful, it is also precarious. The dawning can be mistaken for mere optimism, and if handled without humility, can harden into a new set of projections. This is why integration, rubedo, ultimately requires another dark passage. Mortificatio, a deeper dying. Mortificatio is not melodramatic self-destruction. It is the honest surrender of what still binds the ego to old, unexamined priorities. It is a further burning away of residual illusions. The alchemists described it as a purification by fire, an interior mortification that strips vanity, compulsion, and the last remainders of a borrowed identity. At the center of mortificatio, there is a dangerous edge. The ego is asked to surrender not only habits, but narrative claims about safety and competence. For some, the relinquishment feels like liberation. For others, it feels like being swallowed. The psychological equivalent can look like a severe test of meaning. A person who has leaned into a new vocation may find their confidence shattered by an unexpected failure. Patterns of self-reliance that once seemed useful now appear brittle. When mortificatio deepens, old defenses are removed and rawness is exposed. The risk is real. The psyche, stripped of its habitual scaffolding, may produce symptoms that exceed the individual's capacity to contain them. Hallucinations, severe dissociation, or suicidal crises are not romantic markers of spiritual depth. They are emergency signals requiring clinical care. The alchemical tradition includes dark nights, but it never prescribes neglect in the face of acute suffering. Conjunctio, the coming together, often follows mortificatio for those who survive the passage with support. Conjunctio names the meeting of opposites, light and dark, masculine and feminine, reason and affect. It is the slow recognition that the self is not a monolith, but a dynamic center formed by tension and mediation. In lived terms, conjunctio can show up as relationships that no longer mirror old patterns, creative acts that contain both chaos and discipline, and a sense of authority that is not defensive, but reflective. This is the threshold of rubedo, the reddening that symbolizes integration. But rubedo is not an arrival in a finished state. It is better pictured as a new way of living, one that bears all the marks of human limitation. A person who has reached rubedo is not invulnerable. They still experience grief, loss, and confusion. What changes is not the absence of difficulty, but the manner of presence. Decisions are made from an embodied center rather than from reactive need. Failures are integrated into narrative meaning rather than triggering a return to frantic repair. The person who has undergone this work tends to live with a different temporality, less frantic, more responsive, less theatrical, more faithful to small obligations. Jung himself never suggested that individuation produces a perfected saint. His writings insist on the paradox of the individuated life. Greater wholeness often increases one's sensitivity and sorrow because one has widened the capacity to feel. The reward is not comfort, but a more coherent relation to one's own depths and to others. Vocation, in this frame, is not a celebrity brand. It is the life that refuses to be merely utilitarian, that answers to inner images and calls with responsible action. Throughout these stages, there are practical disciplines that increase the likelihood of moving without collapsing. I will name them plainly, because naming practical orientation does not reduce the mystery. It simply provides pathways for navigation. First, keep your body within reach. Sleep, basic nutrition, movement and routines of self-care are not mere housekeeping. They are stabilizing forces for a psyche undergoing dissolution. Second, record and reflect. Use a notebook not as therapy, but as data gathering, a place where images, dreams, small decisions, and recurring feelings accumulate. Third, cultivate a circle of steady witnesses. People who do not require you to perform resilience and who can, when needed, help you discern when symptoms cross into crisis. Fourth, learn modest ritual and craft. Practices like making something by hand, tending a small patch of earth, or reading aloud to a friend can anchor a life that feels unmoored. Fifth, develop the habit of small experiments rather than grand proclamations. Test, revise, and repeat. Safety must be reiterated with gravity. The psyche's descent can, in some situations, precipitate psychiatric conditions that require professional treatment. If you or someone you care about experiences persistent disruption of functioning, intrusive hallucinations, rapid personality shifts, or suicidal ideation, seek immediate clinical support. Medication, hospitalization, and intensive therapy are not defeats on the path. They are often prerequisites that allow symbolic work to become possible and safe. No alchemical metaphor justifies neglect of life-preserving care. There are also relational ethics to consider. If your transformation touches others, partners, children, colleagues, practice transparency in ways that respect their agency. The alchemical inwardness must not be used as an excuse for withdrawing from responsibilities or for imposing inner experiments on others without consent. Integration includes ethical attention to the web of relationships that sustain and are sustained by you. The role of grace, those non-volitional moments when the psyche offers a symbol, a synchronistic sign, or a sudden clarity, appears repeatedly in alchemical writings and in Jung's reflections. Grace is not something to be manufactured, it is noticed. It may arrive as a dream figure that speaks a single line that cuts open an old knot, or as an encounter with a person who unwittingly says what you needed to hear. Prepare for grace by cultivating receptive practices, meditation, journaling, art-making, and by maintaining the humble expectation that some things cannot be forced. An important humility. Not everyone will reach rubedo. Individuation, as Jung presented it, is rare and partial for most people. For many, the alchemical operations produce partial integrations. lasting changes in some areas, ongoing struggles in others. This is the ordinary character of human life. The alchemical metaphor is a map, not a promise. It offers orientation toward meaning, but does not guarantee that all suffering will be transmuted into narrative gold. To navigate these stages with care, practice what I will call the 3 sustaining orientations: trust, patience, and support. Trust the psyche's purposiveness without idolizing inner images. Be patient with the slow timetable of deep change, and secure support that keeps you present to life. These 3 do not eliminate risk, but they reduce the likelihood that descent becomes catastrophe. If you are seeking a concrete exercise to practice the alchemical attention required across these stages, consider the following week-long protocol. Each evening for 7 nights, write 1 page addressing a single prompt. Night 1. Inventory a loss. Name it in 3 sentences with as much specificity as you can. Night 2. List what that loss has taken away from structure and comfort. Night 3. Name without judgment what that loss may have freed in you: curiosity, time, compassion, disgust, anger. Night 4. Describe 1 small thing you did or could do that honors the freed space. Night 5. Record a dream fragment or image that recurs and reflect on the emotion it carries. Night 6. Test a tiny experiment. Call a friend, enroll in a class, cook a new meal, and note how your body and mood respond. Night 7. Write a short letter to yourself from the vantage of 5 years forward, describing what made this period bearable. Keep the pages private unless sharing them with a trusted guide helps you contain the material. If any of the nights surface unmanageable distress, pause the exercise and reach out for immediate support. This practice is meant as orientation, not as a diagnostic tool. If the content evokes severe symptoms, voices commanding action, disconnection from reality, or impulses toward self-harm, seek emergency clinical care. Safety is the precondition for any meaningful inner work. Across the centuries, alchemists and depth psychologists have insisted on one stubborn paradox. Creation often requires destruction. The blackening is not an aesthetic preference. It is a structural necessity in a tradition that recognizes the way life renovates itself through cycles of death and birth. To lose everything may be, paradoxically, to be given a raw material that cannot be accessed while the scaffolding of the old life remains intact. That is a hard claim, because grief is not a concept. It is a lived terrain of emptiness, and calling it an opportunity does not reduce its sting. Yet, sometimes the crucible produces something that could not have emerged otherwise, a life less oriented around the avoidance of pain and more anchored in a vocation that resonates with felt meaning. How do you know when you are moving rather than merely surviving? Signs are small and relational. You notice that your choices align across time, that you can, more often than before, act from conviction rather than compulsion, that relationships become less about validation and more about truthful exchange, that you are capable of sorrow without losing the capacity to hope. These are not dramatic transformations, but steady shifts. They may not please everyone. Some friends will be confounded by the changes you make. Expect that. Integration sometimes creates distance as well as closeness. To conclude with a concrete orientation, gentle enough for the frightened and rigorous enough for the striving, tonight, set aside 30 minutes and do this single exercise. On a fresh page, write 3 columns. Column 1, losses, list without euphemism. Column 2, openings. Note what each loss allowed to become possible, even if only faintly. Column 3, an experiment, 1 small bounded step to test a possibility you sense in column 2. Commit to the experiment for 1 week. Tell 1 trustworthy person about the commitment. After the week, return to the page and note what changed, however minutely. If this reflection landed with you, consider pairing that exercise with further reading. Jung's Red Book for a raw account of one man's descent into his own imagination, and the Rosarium Philosophorum for images that map alchemical operations in arresting detail. These texts are neither instruction manuals nor prescriptions. They are companions that expand your lexicon for inner experience. And finally, take the title of this piece with both weight and restraint. Losing everything can be the alchemical beginning of becoming who you are. It can also be merely loss. The difference often lies not in a heroic interiority, but in the presence of steady companions, the practice of patient attention, and the sometimes humble willingness to seek help when the depth of descent becomes threatening. If you choose to remain at the shore and watch the tide, do so with companions and a plan for safety. If you must run to take cover, honor that need as legitimate. Either way, the work of becoming is less a singular achievement than an ongoing conversation with what you have lost, with the images that return to you in dreams, and with the small acts that orient your days toward meaning. And if you stayed until the end, let me know in the comments by writing, "I'm still here." Now, I'm leaving another video on your screen if you'd like to continue learning about this. Thank you for being here, my friend, and I'll see you in the next video.